They were taking Jesus to the hill of Calvary. And it says here, now 2 others, both criminals, were led away with him to be executed. When they came to the place called the Skull, they crucified him and the criminals there, one on his right, the other on his left. Jesus said at one point, "Father, forgive them. They know not what they do." And even the soldiers were jeering at him as they approached to offer him wine. Above him there was an inscription that read, "This is the King of the Jews." Now one of the criminals hanging there reviled Jesus, saying, "Are you not the Messiah? Save yourself and us." The other, however, rebuking him, said in reply, "Have you no fear of God? For you are subject to the same condemnation. And indeed, we have been condemned justly, for the sentence we received corresponds to our crimes, but this man has done nothing criminal." Then he said, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." He replied to him, "Amen, I say to you, this day you will be with me in paradise." My name is Dismas. You've heard of me? Well, not all of it, not by any means. But yet, I was there on the Mount of Calvary with Jesus. I was there with the others in my own individual way. At first, to speak of this was awkward, but I was most certainly there, a part of the scene, witnessing and living the momentous event. At this time, without shame, I am hoping you will welcome me here. I express this knowing that some of you, perhaps all, will recognize my name, recall my presence at Calvary. I accept even now, at this late date, feelings of resentment, some errant thoughts about cheap grace and such may still linger. I merely ask that you listen to the story. In truth, I'm presenting this to you, as did each of the others, to help you be at Calvary, the hill of execution, at the foot of the cross. Thus, to visualize as you will, and to live more genuinely, the loving presence of Jesus at Calvary. As a matter of fact, I have done this before a few times in a variety of contexts, for a variety of purposes. I have come to enjoy the experience. This is true in part because I am speaking to you not as the person I was for a lengthy portion of my life, and not any longer as the thief on the cross. All this, of course, is part of me now, even part of who I have become. For you see, in all humility, I am now deeply immersed in paradise. This is the apex, the peak of all life can be, magnificently beyond any and every expectation or description, being completely in the presence of God. One never leaves this, and this colors everything else. But I am tending to get ahead of myself. You might say, this is the threshold of the end of the story. Yet again, it also makes some sense that I would want to begin here, because this is who I am now. This is the glass through which I am able to view all the rest, and it makes all the difference. I want to take you to the beginning, my beginning, how did I come to this hill of Calvary? It's not a pretty story, yet in a way, for all its ugly chapters, it is a good story. It may in some stretch remind you, of course, I wanted to remind you of your story, of your life. Be sure, I am not at any time attempting to appear superior, as if I own some manner of unique wisdom. I generally want you to experience Calvary. For me, it's a mission of love, not one of pride, because I then hope that you too will ask for paradise, the kingdom. My life began in a terribly cluttered tent, pitched on the vast expanse of desert sands of an inhospitable land of Egypt. My family was part of a small community of desert people. My childhood memories are few and vague. It was brief, and it was harsh. To put it bluntly, we were a whole culture of brigands. We were thieves and marauders. We moved relentlessly through our familiar desert with but one purpose, and forget the dignity and value of life. My father, who knew no other way, had long since proved his ferocity and had clawed and murdered his way to the role of chieftain of this cruel clan. By the time I was 8 or 9 years, I was already a scarred veteran of this greedy, unfeeling cult. The same was pretty much true of all the young lads, including my brothers, 2 older, 1 younger. We were professionals at what we did, a veritable small army of insatiable thieves, fully armed with menacing weapons, in what long since had become a way of life. Our leaders, my father and the others, knowing all too well the mysteries of the desert, would plan surprise attacks on small caravans of traders, cautiously finding their way through the desert. Those traders, were seldom any kind of match. The object of these raids seized everything of value we could lay our hands on. The lives of the merchants, men, women, even youngsters, people with whom we really had no quarrel whatsoever, were not important. Our knives and lances slashed and cut and pierced, lives ended. We grew our so-called wealth, and we were gone, and no one looked back. Oh, we too paid a price. Our bodies bore many scars. In our uncouth society, these blemishes were our badges of honor. Comrades died. Grief was shallow, short-lived. Greed is an incomparable motivator, strange, lustful. It manages to benumb all other senses. In our masterful cunning and conniving, at times, we would pretend that we ourselves were a company of traders. We carefully arranged our route of travel to intersect with that of the caravan we had scouted. Although it was precious wisdom to be wary of any stranger in the desert, there did exist a kind of unwritten understanding about hospitality. Usually, the other group would gradually put aside their initial suspicions and come to a more welcoming attitude. Who knows, they thought, for them it may be another occasion for some clever trading. As we noted their relaxing of their guard, perhaps even becoming a bit careless, members of our tribe would slowly, stealthily take up more advantageous positions. They gave us ready control of their entire camp. With practiced suddenness, we had our weapons at their throats. Fear, despair, surrender. Seldom did we fail. Soon our reputation itself had become an effective weapon. However, achieving success in dishonesty, conniving, and subterfuge sooner or later has to backfire. Thieves remain thieves, even in their own company. We were associates in crime, not friends, not really. Greed, power, they become addictive. Your friends, your associates, betray you, seek an edge. You betray them. There were times, brief moments as it were, that I questioned, is this the way to live, really? I was still rather young when I replaced my father as the chief of this motley group of brigands. I, a leader of thieves and cutthroats. I was feared, not honored. They knew. You resisted me, contradicted me, provoked me. You paid dearly. I reported before, not only did we rob and destroy, we took lives. We were blatant murderers. The value of one's life was measured only by one's usefulness. My life, no surprise, was threatened, time and again, often by my own comrades. My response was swift and violent. I must here share with you, my own brother came to his death at my hand. Because of such ongoing tenuous and threatening circumstances in this darkened life, I learned early, out of self-preservation, to read people. Oh, it wasn't ESP by any stretch. One might label it a kind of personal psychology. Initially, the study was based solely on mistrust. I learned to read people's faces, their eyes. I noted body language. I would readily catch the lies, alerted by facial tics, and even the silence. I had to know how many weapons, razor-sharp knives, my potential enemy had hidden within the folds of his garments. Such study, such awareness kept me alive. Somehow, at some unusual moment in my awareness, I found there was a somewhat gentler side to my nature. It wasn't a softness, to be sure, but I was conscious of a tiny seed of sensitivity buried somewhere within. For all the reasons I have shared, and more, you can be certain it was only rarely that some incident would bring me to reveal this hidden side of me. Among our people, religion as some kind of a practice in a person's life would be seen as a waste of time, even a lack of intelligence, perhaps even a sign of weakness. My family might make mention of the gods, which may or may not have some influence on our lives. It seemed to me such ethereal beings were called upon to curse a foe rather than seeking some favor or some blessing. Values rarely surfaced, and even then, most often, to serve one's own advantage. Related to the foregoing, I want to share with you one unique incident that had an unusual impact on my life. I was still fairly young at the time, but I was already looked upon as a kind of leader, especially by men close to my own age. A small group of us was riding a kind of scouting patrol out into the desert, some distance from our own campsite. One of the young men, riding some several yards ahead, turned and shouted back that he had spotted some movement in the desert. All of us moved up, and when I came carefully and quietly over a ridge of dunes, I could see only two people and a rather small donkey. They somehow must have become separated from a larger party. It was not at all wise to attempt to travel unprotected through the desert, for all sorts of reasons. As we drew closer, we saw that it was a man and a woman, she riding on the small donkey. He walked as swiftly as he could alongside. Of course, they had seen us. As I could read them, they were not all that eager to encounter us. Why did that not surprise me? But even now, the first 3 or 4 of our men were on the party. We're already on them, their horses menacing closely and easily keeping pace. The scene spoke of danger for this vulnerable couple. I had been here before. As I came closer to them myself, already beginning to assess what our approach might be, it became very evident that the woman was nestling an infant among the folds of her garments and shawls. My comrades, though still on their mounts, were taking advantage of the fear they thought they saw in their prey. Their laughter was more scorn and ridicule than any real enjoyment. As it appeared, whatever happened here would be according to their designs. Yes, I had been here before. Now, the donkey stopped. The man, who appeared somewhat older than the woman, stepped around to place himself closer to her and to face us. Although he had no visible weapon other than his walking staff, he didn't seem all that afraid, alert and ready, but no fear in those eyes. I slid off my horse. The others gave way for me. From their garb of the couple, I gathered they were Hebrew. Obviously, they were not traders. What were these folks doing, wandering in the forsaken deserts of Egypt? As I came up next to the animal, I turned away from the man. The young woman turned her head. Her face was not covered by the cloth over her head. In her turning, her eyes came directly to my face. She looked straight into my eyes. From deep within me came a warning. This was entirely new. This was not my customary arena. Oh, there was no combat, no threat here. It was not fear, this strange, unusual sense inside me. But in every bone of my body there was an ache. I knew somehow I was not the one in control here. Something in the way I was reacting silenced my comrades. They gave me more room. For the moment, I could not take my eyes from her face, from her eyes. She seemed to be smiling at me. Yes, she was smiling. I was confused, yet a feeling of calm came over me. Her countenance spoke, and then her lips moved, and she was speaking to me. I was so transfixed, I couldn't catch what she was saying. Then the man, her husband, strode quickly to my side. When I was able to look from the woman to him, he began to explain their plight. For some reason, because of their baby, their infant, they were in danger back in Israel, somewhere near Jerusalem. They were escaping, of all places, through this hostile desert into Egypt. I had some strange, altogether unfamiliar feelings as the two of them spoke with me. Who were they, really? As unusual as this encounter was, they somehow were not at all like strangers to me. Their presence, especially the woman, drew me to them. If, in those days, I had had some experience in the exchanging of genuine love, I might have concluded that these Hebrew migrants were expressing love to me. I decided they could use my help. Yes, it surprised me too. I turned to the others now. They were eyeing me carefully, quite stupefied. I directed that all but one of them return to our camp. The two of us then accompanied this unusual party for most of the rest of the day until I deemed they would be safe on their own. Even then, I continued to watch them until they disappeared beyond the dunes. This was about the most amazing, most memorable experience I have ever had in my lifetime. I knew I would never forget the young woman and her exquisite face. As much as I tried, I couldn't read all that was there. And the child? A problem? A threat? For more than 30 years, my devious life continued in the old way I knew, haunting the vast desert, a never-ending series of raids on caravans or small camps, robbing, deceit, at times having to fight for my life. I experienced the inside of prisons a number of times, surprisingly few when you think about it, for all the forays I encountered, the ruthless crimes of which I was guilty. Usually, I was able to escape. The guards, most often, were bandits themselves. Bribes were easy and welcome money. For all of it, it was undoubtedly inevitable that I would meet a violent end, in an embattled raid perhaps, or by the hand of a traitor, or, quite likely, by execution. The latter was my destiny. And in Jerusalem, of all places, as fate would have it, my final crime was not all that grievous or spectacular, at least not in comparison to the texture of most of my life. I was in Jerusalem, actually just seeking enough of a treasure to barter for a horse or a camel to make my way out of there, back to my more familiar surroundings. I crept into a tent just outside the city. It was unguarded and seemed an easy target. I was mistaken. It was a trap, actually intended for two other known thieves. Two of us were cornered and arrested. It was to be the shameful end to a misguided life. I felt nothing. At my trial, my history betrayed me. Unlike court procedures in this land, any and all of my past encounters with the law could be included in the testimony. There, then, was more than enough to convict. Accused, tried and convicted, sentenced, all very swiftly in a short afternoon. Of course, it would be a death sentence, and by the ugly process of crucifixion, I knew well that this could mean a severe beating prior to the actual execution. This was their practice. And the guards were not about to spare me. Their eager cruelty well matched the ferocity which I had inflicted on others in my past. But for all my reputation and the heavy scourging they were more than happy to bring to bear upon me, I was not the main focus of their malicious energy that day. There were two other prisoners being prepared for crucifixion. The one man I knew. He was infamous for his many crimes, which included countless killings. The other one I did not know. I had never heard of him. His name, I heard, was Jesus. Well, I'm guessing this part of my story I really don't have to recount in great detail. Because of all the clamor and excitement surrounding the trial and imprisonment of this Jesus, and despite my own weakness from the beating the guards had given me, I was somewhat distracted from my own concerns. I was growing more and more curious about him, and more about what it was that made him so hated. I found no answers in the prison. On the one hand, the soldiers were still making certain I remained quite absorbed in my personal situation, and soon, I was on my way to Calvary, to my death. Obviously, for at least a time, I lost track of my curiosity. This was not to be a journey one wanted to keep in memory. The road to the place of execution was lined with great crowds. Besides the agonizing pain of that course, all else I recall is the unusual size of the crowd and the clamor. I had witnessed executions, crucifixions before. It was always an ugly scene. For me, even with the cruelty I had lived, this kind of dying had no redeeming value. Interesting that this would be my reflection in those circumstances. People did seem to take a kind of bizarre pleasure in witnessing such ignominious punishment. Their shouts, their curses had to reveal some kind of horrible, even diabolical illness within them. You have to know, even with all the pain and the exhaustion I was experiencing, I was feeling a seething anger. It is true, for the most, this raucous crowd was not really shouting at me. Oh yes, some spit at me and kicked when they came close enough. It was most definitely this Jesus who was their favored target, yet their clamor added to my misery and to my anger, reminding me of my hate-filled resentment for just being here in this place and these humiliating circumstances in the first place. I should have been smarter, more aware of the warnings. Why had I been so careless? My greed finally led me to defeat and to this end. I was chagrined as I struggled with having to face this, and now, on the way to my death, yes, why? Now we were at the top of the hill, Calvary. The soldiers and others wasted no time. They knew their craft. As some were struggling to push me into place, I glanced beyond them. I caught sight of the other two. This was the first time I actually saw Jesus. It was grossly evident. He had taken an even more brutal beating than I had. For a brief moment, the question again crossed my mind. Just what was his atrocious crime? The hatred emanating from so many seemed contagious, bottomless. The executioners continued their task. I know I screamed and cursed long and loud as those rusty spikes sawed through the nerves of my wrists and feet. The laughter and sneers of the soldiers offered no consolation. Even I could not have anticipated the total ugliness and the depth of pain. Gratefully, once the cross was up and in place, the shock began to numb somewhat the searing torture. Suddenly I became aware that the din had softened. People were calling out their curses and ridicule, but the sound was quite hollow now, lacking the earlier gathered wrath. Mostly still, their hateful shouts were directed at just Jesus. Oh, I heard my name and my character reviled. Really nothing I hadn't heard before. Most of it, even then, I knew was fairly accurate. And not that any of it meant anything to me, one way or the other. My conscience had long since been laid to rest. Yet again, it came, that gnawing inquiry. Just what malicious crime had Jesus committed that had to have affected so many so deeply? I began to work on this mystery. I was going to have some time. I knew it was the court's practice to attach to the cross a banner of some kind designating the accusations laid on each prisoner just over the criminal's head. Mine, I'm certain, said something about murder, assault, thievery, so on. Perhaps I could learn something if I could read the placard hanging over the head of Jesus. My cross was situated off to the right of Jesus and at an angle to his position. By turning my head, looking over my left shoulder, I could look in his direction. I could see him. I turned and immediately forgot about the sign as I took my first real look at him. I have shared with you earlier that I had learned to look at others with a cautious, discerning eye. I had become quite expert at seeing through the masks. Now, as I gazed, what I saw was unanticipated. What I looked upon was extraordinary, even breathtaking. No question, this Jesus had been treated badly. His body fairly shouted pain. As you know, they had placed a mass of thorns on his head, adding immensely to his suffering. Yet it was immediately clear to me he was not defeated. Even on this cross, blooding in pain, he was a person of stature, of strength. He was dying, but from within came an undeniable aura of serenity, a spirit of promise. Somehow, I was able to pull my gaze away, recalling my earlier intent. Above his head was the expected lettering in several languages. The charge, King of the Jews. What? At first I couldn't absorb it. Actually, it was only later, in eternity, if you can accept a kind of an aside, that I finally was able to bring into focus the full and true picture. But here and now, this man was guilty of being a king. He was condemned and put to death for this. Yet a further wave of insight washed over me. This is what I had seen when I first looked at him. His cross, for all of this, was a throne. His stature, even in the depth of such dirt and pain and misery, in such ignominy, remained intact. Jesus was regal. Then my eyes came quickly back to Jesus, to his face. His lips were moving. Most of what he was saying I could not hear. I did hear him say, "Forgive them." Forgive them? I was astounded. Forgive them. But then, almost at once, a most unusual feeling of warmth came over me. Contrary to everything I had ever learned or experienced or had ever been, I understood deep within me, a place I had seldom before ever frequented, I was somehow being drawn to this man. No one had ever offered forgiveness to me. Until that moment, I very likely had little or no concept of what forgiveness was or what it meant. Yet here was Jesus forgiving everybody. Yet in this moment, I knew, I understood, and then no, not really did I understand. At that moment, I looked in the direction of the people, the mob, still hovering just several yards away. They were the same, mean of face, tongues vilifying. Understanding was not about to penetrate here. The darkness prevailed. Just inside the main throng, gathered only a few feet from Jesus' cross, was a much smaller group, perhaps 6 or 7 people, mostly women. Most were weeping. I had not really noticed them until now. The contrast was startling. Amidst all this ugliness, here was the softness of genuine grief. This too was a new experience, an unfamiliar feeling for me. And again, somehow, that uncommon wave of understanding was revealing fresh insights for me. As I stared and studied them, one woman in the center of the group stood out among the others. She was grieving. Tears were evident. She stood upright, but not rigidly, but her demeanor reflecting a kind of sad grasping of all that was occurring. As I was sifting my observations, she turned, just her head actually. It was almost imperceptible, but her glance, more than a glance really, was definitely in my direction. And then, surprisingly, she was looking directly into my eyes. The grief was still there, of course, but now just the hint of a gentle smile lit her eyes. She held my gaze for a long moment. If I expected that she would speak to me, there were no words. On the other hand, her face and her look had a message. And suddenly, as she turned away, I realized I knew that face. My thoughts raced frantically over the past, distant memories, events, words, people, until, yes, a mental picture came to the fore. A young woman in the desert, a young girl, really, with a serene and smiling face and holding a tiny infant close to her heart. A long-forgotten moment, a most unlikely scene in a vast, unwelcoming desert. My heart leapt. Strange image for me. Now these unique feelings. It was she. I did not know her name. The woman in the desert is here, close to the cross, grieving. She is grieving for Jesus. Then another light burst into my all too shallow being. Jesus, this Jesus on the cross, her son, the infant in her lap. Here is this malicious, murdering thief, slowly dying on a cross, a death avenging so many cruelties over countless years, and my life is just beginning. Yes, I did experience this feeling. The shadow of my past surrendered. I turned to look again at Jesus, knowing that somehow my fragile spirit would be even further enlivened as I looked. Now Jesus had turned ever so slightly. He was looking in my direction, looking at me. In his eyes was a beckoning. It was more, a kind of quiet, unspoken command. I couldn't turn away, nor did I want to. I knew in that moment that I belonged to him, full bore. Even though I did not as yet comprehend the king identity, I did know the concept of leadership. For all that might be or become, this was my leader, my king. So much was turning around, and so suddenly, the darkness of all the surrounding clamor and hatred did not disappear, but out of this darkness came for me all for which I had been searching throughout the entirety of my misguided life. And then I was speaking, shouting actually. I knew the soldiers would come soon to break my legs, the final stroke bringing death. I had no fear of this, but it would mean that my body, without the support, would sink down, making it impossible to breathe or to speak. Hastily, I spoke in defense of Jesus to the other thief dying on the third cross, hoping possibly he may have had an experience similar to mine. Then those surprising words came tumbling out of my parched mouth. Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. I had no right, but I was beyond protocol. What could possibly happen? A wisp of a smile seemed to join the pain in his face. He had heard me. I cannot really say what I was expecting. Now he, the crucified Jesus, spoke to me, his voice quiet but firm, and with an undeniable conviction, "This day you will be with me in paradise." Death, where is your sting? The next several moments were an extraordinary rush of sounds, sudden movements, of pain, and Jesus breathing his last as one of the soldiers pierced his side with a lance. The guards were there beneath me. Without hesitation and with expert precision, they broke my legs. I was struggling for breath, and then I felt myself letting go. Death now was more than the pain or even the loss of life. It was a kind of escape, an exiting, but more, a simple entry into something for which there could be no effective preparation, no comparison whatsoever. Jesus' promise, paradise, engulfed me now. I knew I was in the presence of God. I had no earthly reference or definitions for such words, but then no words would ever be adequate. It is just beyond description. No human language possesses the words or images. Most profoundly, I knew I was being loved. But then, for what I will speak of as moments, there are no definable limits or measurements that would encompass what was happening. My whole earthly life, moment on moment, fairly screamed across my memory, my very being. The most excruciating feelings pummeled and crushed my spirit. It was the agonizing contradictions of wanting, hungering for, that exquisite love God was literally pouring over me, but in the same moments, yearning to escape from this total goodness because it was so unfitting, as I was experiencing a rapid review of so much ugliness that was the larger portion of my earthly life. Paradise, for one like me, surely must come at a price. You can be certain I paid it. With the help of God's grace and all-consuming love, we won't speak again of cheap grace. And this new life continues. As an indication, I have had conversations, exchanges anyway, with Peter and with Paul and with others. I dearly consider and value that I received the length and breadth of my conversion, my transfiguration into Jesus Christ there at the foot of the cross. My life is now entirely immersed in God. It is impossible to express. All my hungers are met here, and my capacity grows. You have come to the foot of the cross. It is a sight of contradictions. If you listen, you can hear a volume of echoes. But it is no longer a place for hatred. It is a site for grieving, but much more. Grieve here for the crucified Christ. Grieve really for the sins and sinners that brought the Son of God to this altar of sacrifice. Then recall the resurrection. Remain for a time. When you determine it is time to take leave, do so with a pure spirit and a song of true joy in your heart. This will be the most far-flung echo of Calvary. Also, promise to return. We still have much to learn, and this is a fitting place for doing so. Paradise is so much more than a promise. Amen.